cells in lymph.
Fighting the possibility of any infection to make it from a blister or open wound.
Exactly. Got to fight that infection, so it's very possible that you'll have lymphocytes or leukocytes in that that lymph because they're involved in that immune response, fighting infection. And another key thing is they're helping to clean up that lymph before it gets back into the bloodstream. We just got through looking at a picture like this. The reason that we have all that excess fluid out in our interstitial space is because if it's pushed out at the arterial end due to hydrostatic pressure, if most of it's not reclaimed back at that venous end, then we're looking at excess fluid out here in the interstitial space. Which fluid is responsible for pushing it out? Or which pressure rather?
Hydrostatic pressure.
Hydrostatic pressure, that's blood pressure. What pressure pulls it back in?
Osmotic pressure.
Osmotic pressure. So if those two aren't balanced, if you've got high blood pressure or not enough solutes, then you may push fluids out to the interstitial space and they may not get reabsorbed back in at that venous end. So this is where the lymphatic system comes into play. Your lymphatic system is going to come along and pick up the excess fluids. They are scattered through our body cells and tissues, and they provide an alternate route for that excess fluid to get back into the cardiovascular system. These are the more major of our lymphatic vessels. If you want to relate them to something in the cardiovascular system, should you relate them to arteries or should you relate them to veins? Veins is right. Why veins? Exactly. Taking it back to the heart.
Blood pressure.
Yeah, exactly. The pressure here is going to be low. So if you want to relate a lymphatic vessel, think in the back of your mind, oh, it's kind of like a vein. It's low pressured. It's also returning fluids back to the heart. These fluids, however, are not blood, but rather escaped clear, colorless fluids that are out there in your interstitial space. All right, so you've heard all this before. We just talked about them as veins when we talked about this type of vessel. Lymphatic vessels are in fact thin-walled like veins. Some of our lymphatic vessels have valves. And this system is a low-pressure system. One major difference between cardiovascular and lymphatic systems, the lymphatic system doesn't have a pump like the heart. So what we're relying on here are all the other aids to return blood back to the heart. Skeletal muscle activity, breathing, simply moving about, and those valves in our larger lymphatic veins. Those are the things we have to rely on to help move that lymph back. Blood pressure is not going to help move lymph back because there is no pressure in the lymphatic system. This is why people who sit on a bus for hours, sit on a plane or a train for hours, or are bedridden have very big problems with swelling, because the only way to get the lymph back to the heart is just by your activity. And so if you're sitting still for a long period of time, it's not just the blood that is pulling, it's also the lymph that is pulling in those surrounding cells and tissues. Notice the arteriole. There's your red and blue capillary bed. That's where that fluid is lost out here to the interstitial space. Most of it goes back in the venous system. But from that video we watched, we noticed there's about 10% of the fluids that don't get reclaimed into the cardiovascular system. That's where this lymphatic system in green comes into play. Those vessels have doorways that are open, just like a bar at the beach, and they're saying, come on in this way, come on fluid. So these lymphatic vessels have doors that are open, and when the bar gets full, the door is closed. The lymphatic vessel door is closed. So that keeps the fluid inside, and it prevents it from leaking back outside. Because how does fluid flow? From areas of what pressure to what?
High to low.
High to low. So if you get a bunch of fluid to flow in here, and now the fluid is high in the lymphatic vessel, to prevent it from going back out into the interstitial space, close the doors. Keep them inside, right? So notice, you see these little teeny tiny valves? Those are called mini valves. They're tiny, tiny doors. So when the fluid gets into the lymphatic vessel, those doors shut. That prevents the leakage of that fluid back out into the interstitial space. So it's like, oh, I got you, I trapped you. Now we're going back to the heart. So it's almost like a trap door in a way that gets that fluid to come into that lymphatic vessel.
So when you
It could be that. It could be an overwhelming amount of fluid that we can't deal with. Maybe it's just so much that they're overwhelmed. So it's more than perhaps just those doors not closing. It may be just so much fluid.
Or infection.
It could be infection, yeah. It could be proteins inside pulling the fluid out of the vessel. So there's a ton of issues that could be at play here. Alright, so here you can see the process of pulling that fluid in a lymphatic vessel. It is scattered among our cells and tissues, and it acts as an invitation to all that excess interstitial fluid to get back into the lymphatic vessel and travel back to the heart. That open door, that mini valve effect, is what's inviting that fluid to flow in, because this is a low pressure area. And then of course when the pressure increases, boom, doors shut. All that lymph is trapped in that area. Notice the flow here is not the same. So over on page 67 in your course pack, the flow pattern for lymph is not at all like the flow pattern for blood. You might notice this guy has a sticky green half, and the right side of his head, the right arm, and notice it comes right through the chest here. That's because the right side of your body is draining lymph into one vessel on the right side, but both legs, left arm and left side of your head, left side of your chest, drains back into the other side of your body. One of your veins up here in this chest area is receiving lymph that comes back from your entire body. Sure. On the right side of your head, not the whole head, but just the right side of your head, right arm, right side of the chest. It's real hard to see that green there, but it just is the right side of the chest. That comes back into a vessel on the right side of your chest cavity. Everything else, both legs, left arm, left side of the head, left thorax cavity area, all that comes back into another vessel on the left side of your cavity, chest cavity. So it's an asymmetrical drainage flow. Do you see that up here? We're not just splitting your body down the middle and saying right side and left side drain equally. We're talking about this oddball drainage pattern where your right portion here goes into the right side. The left side of your body drains back onto the left side. Do you know which vessel in your chest is receiving this lymph?
Subclavian.
Subclavian. Good. The subclavians, you might recall, are going to ultimately feed back into the heart. So I brought your little model with me. Ugh, right, didn't think you had to do this thing again. Okay, so here come your jugulars. What is this vessel here? Brachiocephalic.
Right.
Right, brachiocephalic.
You got that right.
That got us, didn't it?
So there's your right brachiocephalic. What is this branch?
Subclavian. Right.
Right subclavian, where'd you go? Okay, so into this right subclavian vein, we have a large lymphatic vessel that brings right side of your head, right side of your chest, and right arm lymph all back into that right subclavian vein.
Do the lymphatics have names, or they're just lymph vessels?
They call the right one a right lymphatic duct, but as far as the rest of them, I don't know any. I've never heard of any names for them.
So it's a duct?
It's a duct. It's just a vessel. It's just a large lymphatic vessel, but they call it the right lymphatic duct that brings you into the right subclavian vein. Here's where your rejoin blood flows. Since that is your subclavian, we now travel into your right brachiocephalic, come on down into your SVC, and now where?
Right atrium.
Right atrium.
Right atrium of the heart, okay. So we're going to bring that lymph from just the right portion of your body into the right subclavian, drain that fluid back into the cardiovascular flow. Keep in mind, we're not going to drain the body symmetrically here. We're going to take the left side of your head, the left arm, left portion of your chest, your both legs, and drain that back into the left subclavian vein. So now we're going to bring the left subclavian vein back up with the left brachiocephalic, SVC, and back into the heart. So, for whatever reason, it's not a symmetrical drain. You've got this weird portion of the right that drains separately from both legs. Here's a test question to be aware of. Right leg goes back into which vein?
Left subclavian.
Left subclavian, yeah. Left leg obviously goes back into the left subclavian, but most people get that confused because right leg also goes back into the left subclavian. Where does the right arm drain its lymph?
Right subclavian.
Right subclavian. Where does the left side of your head drain lymph? Left subclavian. So most of this stuff up here makes sense. It's the legs that both go back up onto the left subclavian vein. Okay. How about questions so far?
You said it's on the left side, it's going right to the left subclavian into the
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very good.
On the left side it says left thoracic duct, and on the right it says right lymphatic duct. Is there?
For whatever reason, they have different names for the ducts on each side.
Okay.
Yeah. Why they just don't call them the big old duct or vessel, I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing to note that right lymphatic duct and left thoracic duct. Yeah.
So thoracic still lymphatic.
Still lymphatic, yeah.
So what was the name of the left on the left side?
The left side one there is called the left thoracic duct. That's the big one that dumps you into the left subclavian vein. So for whatever reason, they have a different name for the duct dumping that lymph into the right and the left subclavian. For people who have, maybe a shunt placed into the skull and draining off excess fluid, since the subclavians are receiving that lymph, this may be a place where they will actually hook that shunt so they can drain off maybe excess cerebrospinal fluid. Or people that need, medications administered routinely and they're constantly having to poke a vein, they may also administer one of those shunts placed into these veins in the chest. That way they don't have to constantly be poking a person.
That's when I had my lung surgery, that's where they put my morphine dressing at the
Okay.
put it in there so I wouldn't have to constantly get it in this arm, so I would just press the button and shoot it right into my.
Bingo, right.
But the bad thing about it is like you press it one time and then it has automatic time on it where like you can't overdose yourself on morphine. So you press it and then certain amount of hours pass and then it lets you know it's time to press it again.
Oh, okay.
Press it again.
Interesting. But does it go into your right, your subclavian? Interesting. So, apparently a quite commonly used vessel for placing shunts and whatnot into. So, we've obviously got a concern here, and that's covered on page 68. This lymph is carrying fluid back to your heart to rejoin circulation. That lymph may contain a number of items, good and bad. So we have to be cautious about what is dumped back into the circulatory system, because as you know, circulatory goes everywhere. So if it's a bacterial cell or bacterial population, viruses, cancer cells, we want to make sure we can clean up that lymph before we dump that stuff back into the subclavian veins. Here's where the lymph nodes come into play. They're going to be these little, they're about an inch long, kidney bean sized structures. And their job is to filter the lymph before we return all this stuff back into the blood flow.